But what I think is really important, Barbara, about the message that you're putting out there, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, is, you know, and when I work with our chapter leaders in TCF and training, you know, to try, the language is very important that you use. And, you know, we'll have people say, well, you know, so-and-so died of drug abuse or whatever. But that language is powerful. We don't say to someone who died too young of a heart attack, they died of food abuse, or they died of lack of exercise abuse, or, you know, those types of things. And I think if we can get people to understand, to put substance-related loss on par with other losses.
I also think it's important because there's other people out there that have been through this, and when Barbara is that open and honest with their own story,
Yeah.
they feel like they can go to her and say, look, we didn't want to tell anyone, but we've had the same experience. And she can really touch lives and help people. I think it's great that you're an advocate in making changes on this level in the country, Barbara.
Not use the term substance abuse. That's
Right.
not a term that we use, okay? There is substance use, there is substance abuse, and then there is the disease of addiction, so it can be progressive. But we have a country that assumes that if you're using any substance, you must be abusing it, and you must be having a good time, which is absolutely not the truth in any way, shape, or form. So we work very diligently in the languaging for stigma and in education. For example, we don't talk about a dirty test. We talk about a positive or a negative test, just as we would if it was, you know, a blood test for an infection that you might have, pneumonia or something. So languaging is very, very critical. We don't talk about a drug addict. We talk about somebody who suffers the disease of addiction. Give them respect.
Right.
So language is really, really critical.
Sharing your own story and in being so open, I think that other people can come to you and connect with you. Yes. And say, wow, I've had a similar experience, but I didn't tell anybody.
I can tell you it happens to me in my chapter meetings. It happens to me at conferences. I mean, people line up. I go to all these state meetings. I testify. I sit on task forces. People literally stand in line and wait. I spoke at one of the rallies in D.C., which we do every year, and there was a line backstage afterwards. People came up and said, thank you for letting me own my son again, or my daughter, or my granddaughter, or I have a brother. And that to me, I mean, literally, of course, in my world, I stand in line at the grocery store and I hear a conversation, and I pulled somebody aside. I said, I understand perhaps you're recently bereaved. And then it's an hour conversation about I lost my son or my daughter or whatever. And because they don't know how to talk to people who don't get it, whether it's a car accident or illness or whatever.
I watch it, Barb. I want to share with our audience something, because for me it was one of the most amazing things that I have seen. And I watched Barbara last year in Scottsdale, Arizona at our TCF National Conference. And it was in a packed room of people who had all had stigmatized loss. And, you know, Barb, you probably remember it well too, but I judge a room from the back of the room. And I watched you talking about, you know, the no shame or blame, just love. And I literally could see people in the crowd, shoulders who were all tensed up, relaxing, and tears coming. And there's just something about this message that you're giving that is so powerful that it really helps people.
So the phrase "no shame or blame, just love" actually came to me. It was after one of the conferences, and I was trying to think of a way that we could help people identify others who had some kind of a stigmatized loss, and specifically in this case, disease of addiction. And we give out wristbands that are purple and green. My son's favorite color was purple, and my daughter died before birth, so that loss of promise was the green. And I was looking for a phrase, and I woke up one morning with this on my mind. And so we started giving out wristbands, and now there's over 100,000 of them around the country. We give them out for anything stigmatized, whether it's sexual orientation, disease of addiction, suicide, whatever. And the whole idea that love does matter is what we're going for. And yes, when we start talking about no shame or blame, just love, people do melt. They begin to cry with relief that it is okay to love the ones that have gone on for whatever stigmatized reason it is, to have a lifestyle that some of the public would like to attack. It is just to be accepted as a human being with choice. It can be sometimes the most freeing thing in the world for somebody who's alive, much less for a loved one that you may have lost. So,
yeah.
You know, we have a world that's so judgmental.
One of our listeners, Barb, I think you can just comment on it. It just says,
sure.
When people ask me how my son died, and it's heroin overdose, in parentheses, in January of 2016, so very recent, I simply say tragically. What are your thoughts about that?
Again, I feel very strongly that everybody should use the words or the description that they're ready to give. No, they're ready to give. It is tragic to lose a loved one to a heroin overdose, to anything, of course, but that is one way for me of saying, wow, if somebody said that to me, I would say, thank you so much. Would you like to tell me more? And others might be turned off by that, and that's okay. In my world,
right.
if others don't have the comfort level, then, so one of my teachers is a Jewish man who is a Buddhist abbot. So it's an interesting combination. And one of the things he teaches is how do we sit in the presence of suffering? And for me, I want to be able to sit in the presence of suffering and listen and not be destroyed by somebody else's suffering, but to support them.
Since my son was murdered probably due to his addiction, my brother, who is a chaplain, told me that my son played a part in his own murder. I still haven't told my brother how upset I am that he would say such a thing and don't know how to handle it. I'm finding that just keeping quiet is not helping me.
So I've had somebody in my family say to me that, of course, my son died because he was a drug addict. So I can relate to a degree. What I have found over time is, thank goodness for me, I did have my TCF family. I had others that supported, my process. And that grew over time. The more I talked about it, the more people I found that I could just say things, and we all, in TCF land, we have we can laugh inside the room, so to speak, of some of the most stupid things people say to us that we couldn't necessarily share outside. So I think we have to take care of ourselves, but I don't believe that we can change somebody's mind until they're ready to have their mind changed. I did not find it helpful personally to ask my family to be more compassionate, to ask them to be more wise. But what I did find is over time that my family, they grew up a little bit, not that they were children so much, but they matured and other losses came into their lives, which began to change their perspective. And tragically, the person who said to me, of course your son died, he was an addict, lost a daughter to this disease.
I feel like sometimes people, they want to believe that it can't happen to them or in their family. And
totally.
The reality is it can happen to anybody in any family.
There is no place to hide from this disease.
Yep.
That's true. And I think on this question, too, something about it, her brother is a chaplain. And I think this is something we allude to a lot. I have done over the years many, many workshops for chaplains and ministers and death notification folks and having counselors and therapists in our workshops. And Heidi, we both know that just a lot of times we think that if we go to our minister or a chaplain that they're necessarily going to be well versed in grief or in our grief, and sometimes the loss of a child is something they don't know how to really help us with. So it really doesn't matter a person's title. Many people don't understand this loss and are not capable, even though we would think they would, but they're limited to their own understanding.
The only reason I've ever taken any classes in grief and loss is because I wanted to. They were electives. So my point is, there's a lot of professionals out there that have never had a class in grief and loss, and they're out there giving information and advice on something that they don't really know that much about.
This points to the quote that I have here from Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so.
Oh, I like that. That's good, Barb.
So whether you're a chaplain, I remember this one doctor who really judged her brother harshly for his crystal meth addiction, and he became very, very sick, and she just kept pounding on him because from her perspective as a doctor, he shouldn't do this, and there's no question, it was a horrific addiction. And then her brother died. And after a period of time, she began researching the addictive process of crystal meth, what it does to a body, how it alters the brain, and the mechanisms of getting in the way of decision making and impulse control and all that the brain research can teach us. And she then felt very ashamed at how she had judged her brother. She went back, got an advanced degree in addiction medicine, and now runs a clinic for those addicted to crystal meth. As you said at the beginning, Alan, that after periods of time, we can see some of the commonalities that we share. And I think it depends on the individual. You guys have a lot of experience with this as well. But there are things that we can sit in a group or sit with another bereaved family member, and we can understand that we're not going to experience certain things like weddings and grandchildren or sharing other vacation times or whatever. And those are things that are common irrespective of how we have lost our loved one. But then there's this thing called, like this addiction issue, the substance use disorder, which is what SUD stands for, is substance use disorder, and that's the medical term these days that's used for the disease of addiction. Many of us lived for years with this disease and our loved ones. Many of us, some did not, some it might be very quick, some did not know till after their loved ones passed. But whether it was a long period of time or a short period of time where we found out afterwards, there's all this other stuff that doesn't come if your loved one dies from a genetic disorder or even a car accident. Those are different. They're not better, they're not worse, they're simply different. So for me, I see now the need, I needed to process the anger I had that I didn't get the support that my son could have used from his father, from the other family members, from the medical profession, from the scientific world, from the legal world. I needed to deal with my own grief. If only I'd been smarter or better. You know, as a parent, of course, it must have been my fault that my son had an addiction, that he had this problem, that I happened to choose a father, in his case, that also had this disease in a family. There was a myriad of things that I needed to process, in addition to the fact that my son was gone and I was not going to have a daughter-in-law and grandchildren and all the other things. So while there was common issues of loss, there were things that were very, very specific to the years, the almost 22 years I lived with him with this disease, and the ups and downs, the money spent, the whatever, the guilt. It's a lot. And I believe very strongly that we need to unpack that bitter, you know, shoulda, coulda, woulda, if only, how come, till we get, and then the issues of what we're not going to have.
From what I'm hearing, it sounds like you were shitting on yourself, and you've had a lot of, like you said, should have, would have, could have, and that there was a lot of guilt. And I'm wondering, and then there was also the grieving for the future, and the fact that you wouldn't have grandchildren and a daughter-in-law and all that, because Jim was your only child. What I'm wondering is, how did you work through the guilt and all the I should have done this, that, and the other? How did you stop abusing yourself verbally and beating yourself up?
One of the things that, well, one was TCF. I started going to meetings a couple of months after Jim died. The other was after about 6 or 7 months, I started counseling. I did grief counseling with an amazing, amazing counselor, and she was a godsend.
That's wonderful.
Then the third thing for me that really helped was the research. When I began realizing that there was so much information that I had no clue about the research on this disease, about options, how Europe handles things so differently. There was just so much that helped me see that this is a disease that's badly diagnosed and treated and dealt with, and it's a disease that in this country we had this thing called the war on drugs, which is supposed to fix it and just say no, but that was really denying the reality.
But listen to the wording, and I know you've unpacked this before. The war on drugs.
Correct.
It's so punitive.
Right.
Just that.
Right.
Just
and
that wording.
if you look at, I mean, we had a war on cancer around the same time, and the research on and millions and billions of dollars gone into cancer, and still we have many holes in what can be done with cancer. And the war on drugs was very punitive, and there's great research. And someone asked a wonderful question prior to the webinar about the book Chasing the Scream, and I love that book. I just feel very strongly that it's an excellent book for folks to read, because it gives you some very strong history on the war on drugs, the punitiveness, the laws that were passed, as well as some harm reduction things that could be done, that we are doing in this country. But the war on drugs, what that really essentially did was fill our jails and fill our prisons. And it changed the landscape of where so they do a demographics in the 3rd and 4th grade, and based on test scores of children in the 3rd and 4th grade, they project out where to build prisons.
We're getting some really good questions in here, and I want to get some of these answered, and I don't want to run out of time. And this is a general question. You know, you got issues that are common to all, but Tom sent this question, and he seems like he may be fairly newly bereaved. He said, any tips on how to best handle holidays, Thanksgiving, Mother's and Father's Day, Tom? Just a quick answer from the two of you. Can you give Tom some tips on how you do that?
Sure. I mean, that's a classic, right? When I think about it, I mean, for me, it always including my loved ones in the circle. I include them, I talk about them, and when it makes other people uncomfortable, my rule is that's their problem, not mine. But overall, I think we generally recommend that you do what is comfortable for you. Some people will go to family gatherings, some will choose not to for a while until they can feel more comfortable. I always believe very strongly in doing the memory of the birthdays and anniversaries and their angel dates. I'm sure, Heidi, you have some other thoughts?
No, I love what you're saying. I would just say that if you feel like you might get emotional and you don't feel comfortable bringing up your loved one, but you want their name to be brought up, you want them to be brought up, ask someone to make a tribute or a toast to that person. Ask somebody else to do it for you. Always have an exit plan if you want to leave. How are you going to leave, and what are you going to do? And also, I've got to speak to the sibling experience. If you want to give a toast to your child that's died, I think that's great. I love it. My parents used to do it all the time. However, I would suggest also including us, including your living children as well, if you have living children, because sometimes we feel like we're invisible because the child that died takes up such a big part of our lives. So in other words, if you're going to say, okay, this is to Scott, we miss you today on Thanksgiving, and we wish you were here, and I'm thankful that Heidi is still in my life and that she is here. So just to remember everybody.
And just, do it your way. Be the CEO of how you handle the holidays. Everybody's going to do it uniquely and differently. Trust your instincts. I've got another comment for you, Barb, and this says, thank you so much. Hearing all this is really helping me. Maybe I can look at this differently now. And this is from Jenny. Now I've got another question. It says, I got through the loss of my daughter by sharing with a group of women and some men who had lost children online. I did not feel that I could go to a counselor who had not suffered the loss that I had. How could they really help me? So Heidi, as a therapist, you have some strong feelings. Sometimes not everybody needs to go to a therapist. Sometimes the compassionate friends and a therapist talk a little bit about that.
This is what I would say to anybody out there. And Barbara, it sounds like you got a great therapist. There are some great therapists out there, and there's also ones that don't have a clue. You need to shop around. You go into the first session should always be a session that where you decide, is this therapist a good fit for me? And if they're not, you do not return. So that's what I would say. And I am a bereaved sibling, but I'm not a bereaved parent. However, in my private practice here in New York City, a huge amount of the people in my office are bereaved parents. So I do want to try to ask them, let me know what it's like. Bring me into your world. I'm not a bereaved parent. I think you can be a really good therapist without having the experience. But again, as I said, you need to shop around until you find a good fit for yourself.
Barb, I'll throw this one at you. It says, my uncle is a physician. He continues to refer to my son's death, an accidental overdose, as suicide. It angers me that he doesn't understand the difference and is demeaning to both types of death. It does make a difference how someone dies. Our children should not be defined by their deaths, but their lives. And I agree with that, Rebecca, and I want to, before Barb answers it, say that my comment earlier was, as we move farther down the road in grief, for some of us it becomes less about how they died and that they died, but to many of us it is very important. And Barb, what would you say to Rebecca about that comment?
So Rebecca, without question, unfortunately it's not the first time I've heard that. I've actually heard other parents say that my child chose to use, so he or she basically chose suicide. I don't believe that for a moment, especially given some of the stuff that we know is on the streets today, but I don't ever believe that. In fact, I feel bad that people need to say my loved one died from an accidental overdose, because I believe that any overdose is accidental unless we have something else. And again, I'm going to go back to, your child, your loved one. Again, I go back to the quote from Mark Twain, where ignorance, and having somebody who's a physician that has, quote unquote, all the answers can be extremely painful. And at the same time, I think this is where we can empower ourselves to, however you choose to deal with that person. I believe they are wrong. I believe they are ignorant. And I don't mean stupid or mean, necessarily spirited, but they just don't understand. And if there's anything I could do to help people give them facts and information, I would refer a physician like that to the ASAM, ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is a exploding area of medical professionals in this country today who are getting specialized training and would never make that kind of a comment. So the fact that we have these outgrowths in the medical profession can be very helpful.
Absolutely. And Rebecca, I love your statement. Our children should not be defined by their deaths, but their lives. And for many of us, and I am so blessed to have had the compassionate friends to help me, that's exactly right. And people that move through their grief, that's where we get to the place that we define our loved ones, our children, our grandchildren, our siblings by their lives, not their death.
Out in the world, so often people, when they find out I had a brother that died, they want to know how. They're totally fixated on it. And then when I tell them, they don't want to know anything else. I want to talk about how he lived, and they've got the story, and so now they're on to the next thing. And that's the one reason I love this organization, is because we talk about how they lived.
Grief doesn't change you, it reveals you, and that is just such a terrific quote.
One of the things that helps me a lot is to remember that even though our loved ones have died, we still parent them by keeping their memory alive, by telling their stories, and that's true of our grandchildren as well as our siblings. So when Heidi talks about her brother, and when other siblings talk about, when I talk about my brother Bill, I recently got a picture of my brother that just cracked us all up, and I scanned it and sent it out. We want to keep them alive by continuing to parent them, continuing to be their siblings, and continuing to be their grandparents. So it doesn't stop when they die. That's all.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to take a few minutes to say that specifically since my son died in 2003, what is happening across the country is absolutely an amazing explosion of change. So while many feel like the world has come to an end because their loved one did die, and somebody wrote in and said, I've lost one child and I'm terrified of losing another, and that's not an uncommon concern for many, many people, and I really understand and get that. So just a quick overview here. We do have this epidemic. We know that prescription medications are really what has helped fuel the level of this epidemic in the country today. And through lots of reasons in history, which I will not go into now, but I can most gladly refer people to some excellent books that are easy to read and comprehend to understand some of the history. But our epidemic today is around prescription medications, very often prescribed in ERs by primary care doctors. And we are not talking about the narcotics given for people who have terminal cancer or extreme pain as managed by a professional. We are talking about street drugs also that have exploded in their availability, like fentanyl, carfentanil, as well as heroin. And I bring these up because the trending that we're moving to, and this is recent information from the DEA, is we are moving to more drugs on the street that are synthetic based, such as fentanyl and carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer. These are being produced in China, and they are taking over the production of plant-based narcotics such as morphine, heroin, oxycodone, or drugs along the plant-based spectrum, making them more dangerous, making this country more at risk for escalating epidemics where we're already losing over 99 people a day. Wow. So the issue itself is exploding. It's not going to get better for a while, tragically. That's why, for me, being an advocate, opening up my mind and listening and learning, and then being a teacher. So I feel very strongly that people who make a decision to jump into advocacy, that's great. There's tons to be done. But in advocacy, what I've learned is very successful is if you want to change the law, then you go before your elected professional, your elected representatives, and you tell them your story. You go to, whether it's the city council, the county council, whatever it is, you go to your state representatives, you go to your federal representatives. You put if you want to write to them, you put the picture of your loved one on it, because when you put a face, you start changing people's perspective. Not a number, but a face.
Important. That's interesting.
And that is why we've got so many changes, is because we have more parents and family members, which does include siblings, of course, and grandparents, who are standing before the state and the federal legislatures saying, my child or my loved one died, here's their picture, and you need to do something about it. But I really want to stress this other point. I work with a lot of advocates, and many come into advocacy with an opinion based on their specific loss. But what we're working on in advocacy is to work for the greater good, which means that I came in, and I knew this, I came in as a very ignorant advocate. And that's why I started going and attending legislative sessions and meeting people who knew the legislative process, who understood what was going forward. And today I sit on committees because I've learned how to be but I found out that I couldn't just go make noise. I had to make educated noise. There's no question that my husband and I now have friends that we would not know. We simply wouldn't. We have friends in just about every state in the union, which is really hard to believe. It's sad, but at the same time, they're really friends. The other thing for me is the sweet is I don't have my son any longer, but I'm on the phone or I meet in person people on a regular basis. I'm Facebook friends with a lot of people in recovery. And I can be a surrogate mom to many of them, and I am. And I have to tell you, it feeds my heart. And this is where I get teary again, because I love being a mom. I love it, and I have no surviving children. So I really relish being able to work with the men and women in recovery. Those are the sweet for me. And then, of course, the quote from Winston Churchill is the courage the courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. Clearly, we know that the local chapters are absolutely there for folks, and it gives you that face-to-face connection. And unfortunately, in many chapters, and ours is very similar, where about 50% of our losses, 60% of our losses in our chapter are either substance-related and or suicide-related, as well as everything else, but it's very intense. So the local chapters are really great, and training our chapter leaders and facilitators to understand stigma is really important. For specific support for this, we do have a closed Facebook page. It's called Loss to Substance-Related Cause. It's mostly parents and grandparents. We have a separate page for sibling only for loss to this particular cause. And it's a place where people can rant and rave about the ignorance of those who haven't lost a loved one to this particular substance-related cause, whether it's overdose, organ failure, suicide, car accident. It doesn't really matter to us. And it's a place where people are free to speak about their loved one, post pictures, tell us great stories and memories, and also to vent, and there's a lot of ignorance in the fact that people come in and say, I didn't know there was such a thing as carfentanil, so I must be a terrible parent. That's not true. So these are great resources for people, and they're closed, so they're private and sacred. Of course, we have the Sounds of the Siblings, which is a group that is, again, a closed Facebook page, and that's the sibling loss for any reason, any cause, any age that we have. And then there's other resources such as GRASP, which is a loss after a substance-related death or passing, and then Bereaved Parents USA. So there's really lots of resourcing out there, and there's other segmented groups that I didn't list on here, but these are really key resources for folks.
Yeah, and one of your other hats, as I told people, is that you're also involved heavily in the Loss to Substance-Related Cause, the closed Facebook page, and I know you touch a lot of lives in there, and I suppose you do that in your spare time that you don't have. Mm-hmm. So,
that's right. In between everything else, I'm on those two pages. Yeah, I'm on both of those pages every day, checking it out, supporting, you bet. My wish that that the world would stop spinning for each of us until we're ready for it to start spinning again. And I just happen to like that quote, or the poem, so I put it up there just because it's sweet. That's all.
It is. So let's talk a little bit about, people can reach you at, you've got your email address up here, and you've got your advocacy email address, and then also your website. You have a wonderful website for James Place, and also your Facebook page for it. Barb, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and I know this conversation, we could talk on and on about this subject, but a lot has happened just over the last few years, and it's going to continue to happen. And so I thank you so much for being on this webinar. We'd love to do another one with you because I know there's a lot more information out there. Heidi, this is a topic we encounter every day. More and more of our chapters, more and more of the people that attend our local chapters are affected by substance-related losses and stigmatized losses, and it just seems to continue to grow, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and it's going to continue to grow because of the amount of, and Barbara could speak to this better than me, but the access that we now have to all these drugs, prescription and non-prescription, that are out there right now in the world. So this is not going to go away, and I'm so glad that Barbara is a voice, and her son Jim is doing as much in his death as he did in his life to change the world. So thank you, Barb.
Yeah.
Thank you for keeping his legacy alive.
Yeah, appreciate it so much, Barb. Thank all of you for joining us tonight. And once again, I want to thank Open to Hope. OpenToHope.com is the largest website or really resource place available for grief and loss of all types. They've got hundreds of articles and webinars and television programs and radio programs that have been archived. And we certainly love partnering with them at the Compassionate Friends. You can reach us at the Compassionate Friends, at compassionatefriends.org. So Heidi, on behalf of Heidi Horsley, the Open to Hope Foundation, and the Compassionate Friends, we want to also thank our producer, Heather, who makes this all run smoothly. Thank you for being a part of our webinar tonight, and we'll talk again soon.